Okay, welcome back. It is my pleasure to introduce Margot Phillipps, who started out as a computer programmer but has been teaching for a long time now in mathematics and computing. She's from New Zealand. She's been instrumental in raising the profile of computer science in schools in New Zealand in the curriculum. She founded the New Zealand International Informatics Olympiad team and has been leading that ever since. She's also founded, what is it called? The Programming Challenge for Girls, which is across schools and universities. And there was one other thing. And she's also involved in many different teacher organizations. Another person who I have no idea how you do all of that, but please welcome Margot Phillipps.
Thank you. You'd notice that I cleverly dressed today to match the chairs in here. So I could possibly be disguised. My background is that in 2008, I got involved in advocating for a change for senior high school because I went from teaching in a polytechnic to teaching in high schools and realised that the kids were shooting themselves in the foot if they took my subject because there was no formal qualification in it. Eventually it led to, in 2011, we got some standards for where we work our years slightly differently to in Australia, so 11, 12 and 13 are our senior years of high school, and so we have standards. I've had a long time teaching in Polytechs and was co-author of a report by the Computer Society that actually led or embarrassed the ministry, I think, into forming an experts panel that eventually led to the development of our standards. This bit I'm going to try and go really quickly because I've got lots of slides on it, but it's not amazingly interesting. But our national qualification is called NCA, the National Certificate in Educational Achievement. And Year 11 is generally Level 1 through Year 13, Level 3. And we got our digital technology standards introduced in 2011, rolled out to Level 3 in 2013. There were 5 strands of it, so they're very clear and distinctive strands, and only one of those is programming and computer science. The problem with that is that, well, there are 2 things wrong with it. One is that there's a real push to have everything internally assessed and no external assessment. They started out with about 1/3 externally assessed, but the rest is internally assessed, which means that the quality varies quite a lot. And although we have a body that looks after the quality, they're a little bit toothless, I suppose. And that body is NZQA, the New Zealand Qualifications Authority. In terms of digital technology, it's been an elective only. So for years 11 through 13, you can choose to take the subject. You do have to take some level of numeracy and literacy in order to get the qualification. Those figures there just show you that the uptake in the first year for our standards at Level 1 were quite low. So where you had 160-odd thousand people taking maths, there were, well, I shouldn't say that, that's the number of standards that were taken, only 22,000 in all 5 of them. And the majority of those, the vast majority of those were in this strand that's called digital information. So only 17% of those were computer science. The problem, and it's been raised in this room today by a number of Australians, is the issue of training and professional development for teachers. The only thing that our ministry did was a 3-day workshop at the end of 2010, where effectively you got about half a day on each of the 5 strands. The rest of it has all come from keen individuals and our Teachers Association. So there's probably no one in the room that hasn't heard of Tim Bell, but he's been great at pushing for Google funding for CS4HS events throughout the country. And in the early years, definitely aimed at trying to assist teachers with learning how to teach the standards. The Subject Association, with the unfortunate acronym of NZACDIT, and I can't ever remember exactly what it stands for, is run by volunteers, but it's been probably the best forum for sharing resources for teachers. And I just did a little quick add up there of I suppose you have to remember that our population's probably about the size of Melbourne, so you have to take these numbers into context when you see that. But it's relatively active and very much relied upon by teachers. So the key barrier to teaching computer science and programming obviously is the number of teachers that are in the discipline who are trained or confident in it. I don't have a computer science degree, I've got a maths degree, probably because there wasn't computer science around when I was at university. I still remember with the paperclip pushing out the holes in the punched cards and getting to column 66 and then having to throw it away because I'd made a mistake. So you've got a variety of teachers who are suddenly presented with these standards and a little bit of pressure to try and teach them. There's that survey of 2012 showing the average age of teachers, and that certainly hasn't gone down. 22% had a computing degree. That would have been taken out of the teachers that were responding to the survey, which would have been Tim Bell driven. So it's probably a slightly higher figure than reality. So just to describe what the standards are, and what I'm going to try and present towards the end, unfortunately, which is the more interesting part. The level 1 standard and the level 2 standard, so year 11 and year 12, are quite similar in that for level 1 you had to be able to do a selection sequence iteration with input using predefined functions. Our grading system works on the idea that you can get not achieved, you can get achieved, you can get merit, or you can get excellence, and the way in which you get merit or excellence is reasonably tightly defined. And for the programming standards, what that meant was that you had to be able to do boundary validation for merit and deal with unexpected input for excellence. There was, in addition to 3 credits for a programming standard, there was 3 credits for a planning standard. I'll show you how I do the planning in a minute. And for level 2, it's very similar to level 1, but it just increases to being able to use index data structures and functions. The motivation for my work then was looking at what happened after 2011, because I'd been really instrumental in pushing for us getting some formal qualifications. Once we actually had them, I was quite interested in, well, what's the uptake like? And the way in which you can get the statistics from NZQA that does all the recording has varied a little bit, but in the first year I actually just manually went through and scraped it off the website. After that, they took them away because they said in small schools you can identify who the student might be if there was a class of 1 doing a standard, and so they then made it quite difficult to get hold of the data. Basically got it on a disk that was password given to you and you were not to share it, so it became sort of quite difficult. But you can see that the 3 main standards there, main strands, IM is information management, so that was Word, Excel, database. Media is more web development, and then the computer science and programming strand. And you can see that the numbers sitting were really, really quite sad. And for 2012, the numbers sitting level 1 improved a little bit, but the drop off into level 2 from level 1 the previous year was actually quite marked. So I've left a slide out here, but in 2013 I went, you know what, I can change the world, I can do it. I can get into Auckland and go around schools and teach programming. But in order to work part-time, I had to make some income, and so I had to charge the students, and that was definitely a barrier. And long story short, talking to a local company called Datacom, they said, well, we like the idea, but we're going to change the model. So you will go into the school, there's got to be a teacher learn as well. It's free for the students, and also we will put people from our company in as volunteers to tutor. So we had 3 years, various numbers of classes at different times, but the idea was that the student would come once a week after school for a term. They had to commit to it. The teacher or teachers, like it was open to any teachers, not just the digital technology teachers. would come along, and it was expected that they would actually learn alongside the students. The volunteers, I had generally one, but sometimes I had two, and it did tend to be more successful if I had two. But especially if there were teachers trying to learn as well. So it meant that you could devote one of the volunteers to actually hand-holding the teachers while you were, and the other volunteer were helping the students. The Datacom obviously was interested in presenting that this was effective and that it made a difference, and so they were interested in the grades that the students were getting. My feeling is that that's probably a little bit disingenuous, because if you were turning up every week for a term to do something extra, you were pretty motivated. You were likely to do well. And so I got better than average, better than the New Zealand average in terms of my results, but I was going to anyway, I think. Wouldn't have mattered how bad we were. Why did I choose Python? Because it's a rapid learning tool, obviously. I guess the fact that you can put a prompt into an input statement, I learned very quickly I shouldn't do that, because the whole idea of what is input and what is output can actually be quite confusing to students. I liked the indenting in Python. I love the indenting in Python because it matches identically the way in which I teach planning. And the ELIF, possibly not helpful initially, but then once they've seen what it does for them, it becomes a really useful tool. The merit requiring the validation and just having a straight validation loop probably wasn't too difficult for most students. Most people could get the concept of it, and when you chose the assessment instrument, it always was a case of just making sure that there was an integer input that had boundary values on it, and so long as you did that, the kids could get merit reasonably easily. The excellence has to deal with unexpected input. So you had to have integer input so that they could type in a string and have it crash on them, and then see, well, actually you want to try and capture that. The way that I did it was with a try except, and I have to say that that possibly wouldn't be the way that I would do it on reflection. I've thought about it a lot more now, and it just complicates the code, and it complicates the logic in their head. They don't understand that capturing an unexpected type of input is actually logically the same as capturing a value that's out of bounds. So in terms of the logic, we're just trying to do the same thing, but then to get them to understand, well, that's looking harder than it is logically, because suddenly when I do it in Python, I make it way more difficult, and I change the structure of the program quite enormously in order to do that. So that was how I did it. Not altogether sure that's how I'd want to continue. How am I going for time? Oh my God. Thank you. I tried to leap through that bit. So the schools that I went into, so this was under the Datacom program, so it was for the 3 years that Datacom was funding me to do it. We have decile ratings for our schools in New Zealand, which are indicative of the socioeconomic area that the students are brought from. So 1 to 4 is low socioeconomic, 5 to 7 is kind of middling, and 8 to 10, that's your lawyers and your doctors are the parents of those children. And so I had one school that was an all-male school, low decile, one that was female in that same decile ranking, and one that was co-educational. In the 5 to 7, I had one female school and 3 schools that were co-ed schools, and one high decile girls' school and 2 that were high decile. Auckland Grammar and Brackets I taught in one of the classes in 2013, and I also taught them, so I teach in the last school there, Sunderland, and we're actually a Cambridge school. We don't do the national qualification, so I also taught a hobby class there. So they weren't really part of sitting the NCA standards, so they were schools that I went into and taught programming to, but they have a different assessment model. So they were Cambridge rather than NCA. So those were my statistics. So the first numbers are the number that actually started, the number that completed, and the percentages in red that actually achieved credit, and the percentage of those that finished that achieved credit. So then the last blue numbers all look reasonably high, because if you're going to hang on there to the end, there's a reasonably high chance that you're going to actually get the credit for the classes. No, actually, let's go back to that. So, no, I said go back to that. I'd just like to talk a little bit about this and my experience of it. The male school in the low decile was probably, well, you can see by the numbers, it was the saddest school. Thank you. The female low decile school was probably the one that I felt like was the most successful. And my reason for that is that the girls in that school had no inhibition. And that didn't make it necessarily the most comfortable classroom to be in, but they were prepared to give everything a go. They dived into it, tried things out, found stuff out on themselves, and were really, really well motivated. Down the other end of that line, in the decile 8 to 10 school, you can see that the percentage achieving credit is slightly lower. Of those that completed and got credit, it's not too bad, 88%. But that school probably drove me to distraction. I found it incredibly difficult to teach those girls. And part of it was a culture of, I mustn't make a mistake, I must get everything right. And that I just found really, really hard. And I'd say to them, girls, you've got so much talent. But if you were a room full of boys, you'd just be diving in here, you'd just give it a go. But you couldn't convince them that the best way to learn programming is by failure. You know, and the Grok learning statistics that were shown in the keynote this morning shows that, doesn't it? That you don't get there the first time. Sometimes it takes you 128 times, but you do get there. But if you don't make that first step, you're never going to get there. And I did find that class amazingly difficult. And so that female line was actually the most interesting one to me, is that those low decile girls just give it a go. And the high decile girls, nope, got to get it right. And in fact, a couple of girls pulled out of it because they were scared they wouldn't get excellence on their transcripts at the end of the year. Okay, so differences that I found, decile 1 to 4, I had 2 male helpers in there. Their maths was really weak. You know what the school is, so I should probably be careful, but I felt like in that school there was a culture of, I'm going to spoon feed these boys to get them through, because there is a real push to get and increase the level of attainment particularly at level 2 for Polynesian in New Zealand, and that school is largely Polynesian. I took extra time with it. By taking extra time and slowing things down, it meant that I cut out the ability for those students to get excellence, because I couldn't actually spend the time on that, because I was limited by the term. The girls in decile 1 to 4, so that's the school that I loved, the teacher in that class actually had a computer science degree and just went, oh, wow, I'm really excited about this. And he's actually now a computer science teacher, moved over from maths. And in the co-educational, oh, by the way, their reference to food there is that some of the teachers supplied food, and it tended to only be in the decile 1 to 4 schools, so it was kind of like the kids are possibly not turning up with lunch, and so we're going to feed them before they start trying to work after school, which is really good for them. The students in those in the co-ed schools tended to not want to interact as much, and I found that quite difficult. Like I felt like I was kind of almost muscling in on them. I had taught 2 boys at one school who in level 1, and they wanted to do level 2, and the way they had to do it was to travel across to this school. So they did, and they were highly motivated and tended to interact. But as I say there, they tended to trust each other more than me, and the grades probably weren't as strong as they could have been if they'd been prepared to interact a little bit more. Decile 5 to 7, that girls' school was also reasonably difficult. They had more of the characteristics of the high decile school than the low decile school in terms of roll up my sleeves and just have a go, be prepared to fall over. They were less keen to do that, and they found validation, that whole concept, and how to write a loop quite difficult. And in those middle decile schools and the co-ed schools too, the maths varied enormously, and I think that had some impact on, you know, if you're teaching modulus, just because it kind of gives you the chance to do some interesting exercises. If they can't do division, they can't understand a modulus operator. So it was, yeah, that was quite difficult. And in the decile 8 to 10, as I say, that girls' school, thank you, I found they turned up, they were fantastic. They were always there, they were neat, they were tidy, all those things, but they just would not experiment. They did get extra help at lunchtimes because one of the teachers was mad keen. Unfortunately, she's gone off on maternity leave, but she was a science teacher and she, ooh, I like this. So she's really gotten into it and gone to CS4Hs, etc. And the other schools that were co-ed, I have to say there were no girls there, so even though they were co-ed schools, the girls didn't turn up, and the boys were very much, you know, cap on backwards. Sorry. When I first started teaching programming at polytechnics, it was the kind of thing to wear your cap backwards. So 18-year-old boys come into your polytech class and they fold their arms and they've got their cap on backwards, and it's like, what can you teach me? And there was a little bit of that in the high school, not quite so pronounced, but still very, reasonably confident of their ability, but because they were resistant to instruction, they didn't probably do as well as they could have. Just to give you an idea of what the problem looked like for level 1, this is not a level 2 problem. As a source, I use programming competitions, so I just go and grab easy problems and then turn them into something that I have to do validation on an integer input. That makes it something that can be used as an instrument. So it was just the idea of a virtual pet, and you fed it or you exercised it. And the little fish hook is that if you actually took its ideal weight below 0, it died, but you were allowed to keep feeding it. So and the only output was a happy face because it was between half its optimum and double its optimum, or it was an unhappy face because it was outside of those bounds, or RIP because you had actually killed it, even though you kept feeding it. This is the way that I plan. It only works for level 1 and level 2, doesn't work for level 3, but it's called a structure diagram. Has anyone ever seen one? Yeah, so it's a New Zealand invention. And the kids go, oh, we're going to find that on Google. And I go, you can't. There is no such thing. But I love it because, as you can see, as you go down the levels, what does it relate to? Indenting in Python. So each layer of that structure diagram actually corresponds to an indent. There was a talk this morning where I actually asked the question about what design tool did you use, because if you don't show design, you can't, you got a lower grade. And for us, if you don't do the design, you don't get the credits for it. So you do have to do design. And I guess my instinct is that there is so much for kids to learn at level 1 that teaching them to plan something that they don't actually understand is nigh on impossible. And so at level 1, for the first year, I go, you know what, you're going to reverse engineer your planning. And I actually don't have a problem with that. I know that it seems like a contradiction, but if I said to any of you in here, can you design a ball dress before you sew it? You probably could. Because you know what sewing is, you know what fabric is, you know what a ball dress is. But if you say, go and design this program to feed a pet, they don't know the language, they don't know the constructs, they don't know what they can and can't do. So I reckon, well, you can get three credits here by reverse engineering, but at the same time you're learning a tool. And next year I would expect you to be able to use the tool to help you plan your program. So it was in reverse, but I think a good learning opportunity. The teachers that I dealt with, one had a CS degree, I've already talked about. A couple had done an online Python course, but they actually weren't confident. One had done a MATLAB in their degree. A couple had done some university course that was kind of set up particularly for this situation. Both of them not particularly happy with it. The problem always with programming is, and my expression is, build muscle. If you don't build muscle, in other words, just do lots and lots of coding, then it doesn't become second nature. You don't feel confident with it. And in one term with the teachers, that was not enough time to build muscle. What did the teachers say? Some of them really, really liked it. Some of them have continued with it. Some of them have continued with it even though it's a struggle. And I really take my hat off to those ones. And that's it. Thank you. Shall we go back up so you've got some light? So are there any questions?
Thank you. Questions?
Hi, Margot. Thank you for that. You made mention of error handling, I think with the try and the accept, and you mentioned you wouldn't do that in retrospect. I just wonder, is there something you do instead, or would you choose a different complex kind of element to include in your teaching there?
So one of the things that you could do is actually look at the assessment instrument and see if there's any way of getting exceptional input that was not that, but also possibly using the is digit. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Further questions? Ooh.
How do you use your homework to teach? Because the use of homework was good.
So that was a comment from actually from a couple of the teachers, that I needed to put more exercises in front of the students and expect them to complete them for the following week. I was always a little bit reluctant to load homework onto them because this was an extra for them anyway, and I didn't want it to become a burden. So I tried to structure it in such a way that over the term, turned out to be often slightly more than a term, they actually had enough practice in the time that they were with me. I would suggest things that they could do and websites that they could go to, but I didn't insist on it. I think a lot of the teachers actually said what they really would have liked was for me to turn my course into notes or a book or whatever, because I'm not quite a full-time teacher, but I'm a teacher already, and I was doing this as after school. Like, I worked out last year, I was probably working about 1.6 jobs. I was like, oh, too much, yeah. So there's never been the time to do all the things I'd like to do, yeah.
Yep, there's a question.
You mentioned that more than the boys, the girls in the upper tier classes were punctual and orderly, but not willing to experiment even when encouraged. Are you saying that that's special to programming, that programming needs that, and they'll flag if they don't have that experimentation? Is that broadly applicable to subjects, and what would you do to address it?
So in that particular school, I had about 4 teachers sitting in on the class. And when I gave the little pep talk, all of them came to me afterwards and said, and I did it several times, say, look, just have a go, girls. They said, this is what we strike all the time. Yeah. So whether it was a characteristic of that school, I don't know. I haven't been in enough other, high decile, girls-only schools to know if that's the culture. I suspect it isn't. I suspect it might have been that school. All I could do, because you're only there for a term, is just encourage. Just go, look, give it a go. What I did with that class one day, which I didn't do with any of the others, was I actually actively turned it into a competition. Right? So I came along with bags of chocolates and sweets and goodness knows what, and I just gave them, okay, first put them in teams because girls like to work together. First team to draw me a structure diagram and code, I don't know, the equivalent of Hello World, right, chocolates. And by the end of an hour and a half, I had them all pretty well engaged, and they'd all done a lot more than they would have done anyway. And that, what that did, of course, was throw one of my lessons out to get to the end. I mean, having to try and get them to being able to write the standard, to give them the possibility for excellence level in a term was actually quite a lot of work. But that, I think, did pay dividends. So you'd think that competition would be like anti-productive, but it was actually productive, yeah.
So you don't like the ELIF. You said that it's confusing, and so I expect that you're doing nested if statements?
So what I did was I did go back to ELIF, but I didn't use it to start with. So here's my structure diagram. And you can see that when you've got nested decisions, you go down a layer. If you have ELIF and you use it, then it doesn't go down a layer. So what I would do was probably teach it like this and then go, oh, you know what, that's really, yeah, my code ends up straggling down the page. But if you teach that first, I found that there was a degree of confusion. But so you let them see it straggling down the page, and then you go, you know what, we could make this a whole lot better. And then they understand why you have it and the benefit of it. Yeah.
Do we have time for one more question? No, we don't. Okay, thank you very much, Margot. Here is...
Oh, thank you.
Okay, we have another 10-minute break.